a curious thing to say. He was the fifth in the line of succession. So it was not something that was expected for him to be the king of Portugal. He was the brother-in-law and cousin of his predecessor, King John II. So it's quite something that is going to be a brand of his kingdom and of the Manueline of itself. Now we have here, just to inform you, the political map of Europe, more or less in 1545 after the fall of Constantinople. And we see here the several states that we are dealing with during this time. And this is the population of Europe. You see here at your left, the Lisbon as one of the large cities of the time. And in the Iberian Peninsula, we have the unification of Spain with the Kingdom of Spain already after the conquest of Granada by the royal couple, Fernando and Isabel, and of course the Kingdom of Portugal, an independent kingdom. This is the map of Portugal. Perhaps most of you know the map of Portugal, and we are of course, speaking on the Manueline style. I must stress that the Manueline style is a 19th century designation. As I wrote in this slide, it's a variation of the late Gothic. It's not absolutely original in that sense. It's overloaded with ornament, and it has some proclivities, some originality in some architectural solutions, not in all the buildings built during the kingdom of Manuel, but it is it is good to notice that it's especially this overloads ornament that makes the Manueline a Manueline style, a national style, as it was invented in the 19th century. At the time, in the 16th century, in the late 15th, early 16th century, it would be called by foreigners ad modum Hispaniae, at the fashion of Spain, because it had some details that came from the Moresque, not influence, but from an import of Moresque motives, and it was a bit strange for the foreigners that were, in a sense, more used to the late Gothic of Central Europe or to the early Renaissance in Italy. Here we have the cities that have an heritage, a Manueline heritage, the main cities with quite important Manueline heritage. And just for information, during the time of the Manuel, what we call here the Portuguese Empire was at this size. You see that there were several fortresses that were founded by the Portuguese. Actually, there were trade posts in the whole of the world, from Brazil, Western Atlantic, India, etc. As I've told you, Dom Manuel didn't expect to be king of Portugal, but this is one of the reasons why the Manueline has this kind of overload in terms of symbols, in terms of ornament and decoration, because he wanted to legitimize himself, and he wanted to legitimize a new branch of the dynasty of Avis. This was a new branch, and he has to reinforce his image. Also, he was fond of the ideal of crusade, and he wanted to rescue Jerusalem. It was actually something that was cherished by all the states, Christian states in Europe, and to reconquering the Holy Land. So we have to see or to interpret this monarch's policy, the Eastern policy, as the opening, with what we call the opening and exploration of the route to India, as something that wanted to, in a sense, to make a contact on the alliances to the supposed Christian kingdoms that existed in the East, and also to defeat the Turks, actually, the Egypt Mamelukes, as it was said at the time, in the Near East, and reinforcing also in North Africa all the Moroccan Portuguese fortresses and trade posts. This has to do with the conquest with several conquests that came before. Also, during the time of the Manuel, there were some personal myths that he intended to put forward, and some of these myths, I think that we think, not me, but several other specialists think that is in a sense based on the theories of Joaquim de Fiore, Joaquino de Fiore, Joaquim de Flora, which defended a Trinitarian way of intending the progress of the world towards an evangelized, Christianized world, paradisiacal world. And this conducts us to this idea of the Fifth Empire, the foundation of a Fifth Empire as it is prophesied in the book of Daniel in the Bible. So all these things came together, and several topoi, several typical endeavors of other kings also were, in a sense, also present in Dom Manuel and in the court. Dom Manuel was at least represented, or he saw himself as a new Solomon, a new King David, a new Magic King, a new Caesar, a Constantine, or a new Constantine, founder of Christianity, and the father of fatherland, the father of the state, the founder of the kingdom. So he was seen as an emperor. He saw himself as an emperor. And that's one of the reasons why he adopted, or someone gave to him, the armillary sphere as a symbol. It was actually John II that gave to Dom Manuel this emblem. This is typically late medieval emblem. Spera in Deo et fac bonitatem. Trust in God and make the right things. So you see that this motto associated with this symbol is something that pertains to our history, and it remained, actually, it's quite incredible, in our banner, in our actual banner. The Portuguese banner that we are seeing here still keeps the armillary sphere with the coat of arms of Portugal, which is something quite interesting, because we live in a republic, we don't live in a monarchy. Of course, dealing with all the monuments that are the buildings that Dom Manuel built, it's difficult. So I've chosen two buildings: the Jerónimos monastery, the Santa Maria de Belém monastery here in Lisbon, its cloisters and the south doorway, and also Tomar, the convent of Christ in Tomar. We will see that later. In the Jerónimos monastery, we are facing a late Gothic Manueline building, as we can see here. We can see here the southern doorway, which is very important in terms of symbolic economics of the building. This is a huge Hallenkirchen, a huge old church, an extremely huge old church, one of the biggest old churches in Europe, and it's quite a feat in terms of architecture. We are now focusing on the cloisters and in the southern doorway. In the southern doorway, we see something that has to do with the way that, for instance, the late medieval times saw the coincidence, what we call typological opposition between the New Testament, the New Testament and the Old Testament. So we see here an axis that is defined by the Saint Michael, Archangel, the Virgin Mary, and the uncle, the grand uncle or grandfather uncle of Dom Manuel, which was Henry the Navigator, actually, which is here in the axis of this doorway, and which is an homage to the founder of a small chapel from where Vasco da Gama departed to the first voyage, to the first trip to India, and where he returned after discovering the maritime route to India. All the other figures or the other images are a combination of Old Testament personalities or agents and New Testament agents. And this is quite interesting because this kind of discourse of uniting the both testaments has to do with the strength of the message that Manuel who wanted that should be presented in the beach in Belém. Belém in Portuguese, as we say it, means Bethlehem. It's the same as Belém, the crib, the place where Christ was born. So everything here in Belém, in a sense, remains as a reminder of that crib of Bethlehem. And this has to do with this idea of uniting the world through a Christianized endeavor within the construction of this fifth empire. If we look at the distribution, for instance, of the symbols in the cloisters, we see that there are several. This is a scheme. And in this scheme, we see that we have now in blue the instruments of Passion of Christ. So this is a Christian discourse, a very stable Christian discourse, of course, and a normal one. Let's say that this is a banal discourse, and we have here the several medallions with the coat of arms with the instruments of the Passion of Christ. This is interesting, and in itself is something that has to do with an idea of reflection within the house, the monastery itself, the reflection of the monks that should think on the Passion of Christ. This is one of the first steps of this kind of emblematics, serving as aide-mémoire, as memory springs towards the reflection on the Passion of Christ. But besides this, we have also heraldry, a strong presence of heraldry. And this is something that characterizes the Manueline. We have here the heraldry of the Queen Mary, of the Avis house, the heraldry of Portugal, the coat of arms of Portugal, and the emblems of Manuel, of M of Maria Queen, M of Mary, of the Virgin Mary, and M of Manuel, and also the emblem of Queen Mary. The flowers, açucenas, I don't know how to translate it in English, the açucenas. And what happens is that when we look at these medallions, I'm going to show you them again. When we see this succession of these medallions, we can, as I've told you, think on something that was published later, which has to do with the use of the art of memory. And here we are looking at a book with an instruction and a game which is quite interesting, and this game has to do with the virtues, with Christianity, and with the teaching of the prince, the one of the princesses, Catherine, and the art of memory was certainly used as one of the trademarks of this disposition of medallions in the cloister. Of course, you see here there is here something that links this kind of game, because it is a game, and we have here tokens, which are circular tokens, which reminds us, of course, of the medallions we've seen in the cloisters. These are tokens to use in the game. And we have also this tree of excessus and defectus, good things and bad things. And this kind of opposition is also something that was translated into a tree. And this is quite curious, because we will see that this is repeated as a tree of memory. We have here a detail of the 5 wounds of Christ in one of the medallions, and also in other documents, or in documents, illuminated documents, detail from Leitura Nova, also with the 5 wounds held by 2 angels in a medallion similar to the medallions we see in the cloisters of the Jerónimos. We have also in the upper floor of the Jerónimos a theory of images concerned precisely with the virtues, also the main actors of the New Testament, and this kind of combination is also quite well reproduced here in the West Wing, North Wing, East Wing, and South Wing. We have the allegories of prudence, allegories of charity, allegories of faith, allegories of fortress, temperance, liberality, allegories of hope, etc. You see here that we have the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 church virtues, combined with other figures of saints, evangelists, and prophets. And we see now why this system was chosen to the ornament, to the decoration of the cloister of the order of Saint Jerónimos. And we have also in the southern part of the southern face of the cloister several busts, several images that traditionally are explained as the 4 navigators: Pedro Álvares Cabral, Coelho, Paulo da Gama, brother of Vasco da Gama, and also a son. Well, I don't think that this is a representation of the navigators as we see here. These are generic representations. And what we are dealing with here is more or less like a reproduction of the medallions della Robbia, medallions of the big condottieri. In fact, this is the representation here of the 4 kingdoms, or the 4 empires that came before Christianity, that came before Christ, which is symbolized here as Sol Invictus, as Christ itself, as the materialization of the 5th empire. So this is something that even I try to explain better, making this colorful painting on the stones, because this is more or less, these medallions, translation into stone of Della Robbia medallions. If we paint them, if they were painted, they would be painted this way. So that's one of the reasons why we see here the sequence of the medallion with the 4 figures of the 4 big empires that have been defeated, and which has a relationship with the prophecy of Daniel in the Old Testament, when he prophesies a 5th empire. the God of heaven will raise up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, and this kingdom shall not pass to another people. He will break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, but he himself shall stand forever. The dream is certain and its interpretation true. So this was read by everybody in the court and by King Emmanuel himself and the programmator of these cloisters. In the Convent of Christ, we find another kind, but with a similar sense, symbolism, heraldic symbolism. The Manueline Church of the Convent of Christ is a church that was ordered by King Manuel to enlarge the convent of Tomar, and the Manueline Church and its west facade is something of a huge and very well-known and celebrated monument in Portugal and in the world. It's one of the best well-known architectural Portuguese monuments throughout the world, as well as the Tower of Belém here in Lisbon. But this is one of the symbols of Portugal, in the sense of postcards of Portugal. And you have here one of the stars of this monument, the famous west window of the church of Dom Manuel. This was built in 1513. It was finished in 1513. And you see here what I told you about the Manueline. This is late Gothic, of course, but this is a combination of several and quite confusing, and Nuno Senos will explain this better, why there is a confusion and the problems with the concept, because it is strange. It is strange because you cannot identify perfectly what is at stake here. What are these representations? Of course, there is an explanation for all this. There are prescriptions of the Bible that tell us why this happened. And some of the things that we should stress is that this church, perhaps, I'm not sure, but I think that everything goes into this direction of this interpretation, is more or less like a representation of a replica of the Temple of Solomon, as it was thought at the time. And we have here, if you have the patience to read these slides, we have here the sequence that explains why this church was built the way it was and with this symbolism. We cannot forget that the libello de aurea aetate, I will return to this later, was presented to the papal court, Julius II, the Pope, in 1507. It came to Portugal as a copy in 1508, and in 1510 the commission for this new church was ordered by King Manuel. And this is the order. Of course, it is in Portuguese, and there are several measures that are quite well defined here in this commission. The measures of the church itself are very well defined, and we see here the way that the commission is made, and the way that all these dimensions in brasses, I don't know how to translate it in English, have been used to define the structure of this church. We have also a chart here that explains the presence of the double square or the double cube as the proportions used into this church, and we have, of course, the correspondence and what was the evolution of the building, of course, with some adaptations, and this became a building as we see it here in a drawing, a very simple drawing, to explain the large box, the large church box over the sacristy box, and with the famous window here. And this is the west facade with the buttresses. Of course, this is a replica of the Kingdom of Solomon as a model building. This is what we call biblical interpretatio, an interpretation of the Bible. And we see here the several architectures that we know that appear in the Bible, and of course the Temple of Solomon, the several editions that we see of the Temple of Solomon within the several books of the Old and New Testament. And this west facade, as I've told you, a relationship with the libello de aurea etate. It was presented by Egidio da Viterbo, which was to become a very important person. We will see that later. And it is divided into chapters, and these chapters are quite interesting to notice that they are here to it's when the declaration of the celebrity of the power of King Manuel, and this was presented to the king at the time in 1507, as I've told you. And if you see the Golden Age excellence, which is the second part of the De Libello of this discourse, you see that the Egidio da Viterbo was precisely presenting the perspectives under the edges of Julio II, enumeration of the feats of the Manuel, the enumeration of the Pope's deeds, the fate and role of the monarch, Dom Manuel, and later, in the end, the peroration. And all this beautiful, it's a beautiful discourse, is mainly based on the dream of the felled tree in the book of Daniel, and also in the prophecies of Isaiah, as we see here, because Manuel, his name, was something that in Hebrew meant God with us. And so there is this kind of collage between in the discourse, between the name of the Portuguese king, Manuel, and the birth of Christ. And of course, the birth of this new Christianity, of this new empire. And the question here is that as we are dealing here with the main building of the Order of Christ, the king was the governor of the Order of Christ, curiously. The oak tree is one of the main subjects of this ornament. And this oak tree is present in the prophecy of Isaiah. It is present in the coat of arms of Julius II, which was from the family della Rovere. That's or better, from the family of the oak. Del Rovere means oak tree in Italian. And it's also a mnemonic tree that Egidio da Viterbo explains here. And if we look at the several schemes that explain the several symbols of this extremely complex program, we see that we have here mainly heraldry symbols, and divide between the left and the right side, between the spiritual kingdom and the temporal, the kingdom of man, the temporal and kingdom of man. And we see this is the buttresses with the ornaments, with all the symbols that pertain to this kingdom of man. For instance, these are carriers of the coat of arms, which are, of course, profane, a profane symbol, because they carry the coat of arms in pageantry, in city pageantry, in the city feasts, and representing the kingdom. And in this side, where the temporal world is presented. The roots of the oak bark are cut. This is not, they are not broken, they are cut, they are represented as cut. They don't have any kind of roots. But in the other side, in the spiritual side, the coat of arms are carried not by profane people, but by angels, by the archangels. And these archangels are flying. They don't have any kind of support, so they are flying. And this is something that has to do precisely with this spiritual idea of the kingdom of the spiritual in the left side, our left side of the buttress in this facade. And of course, the roots are complete. As you see here, the roots are complete. The roots are rooted in the earth. And of course, some of things that we also find here mainly gives us an idea of all the heraldic symbols, and none of this has to do with maritime symbolism, as usually is told by some guides and some books even. This is mainly a celebration of the King of Manuel, and this old man that you see here is carrying this tree, and this tree is nothing else than the tree, the Joshua tree. This man is Joshua, and the Joshua tree is the tree where the Virgin Mary was born, and is from the genealogy of the Virgin. And after the Virgin Mary, it was the tree, the genealogical tree of Christ itself. You see here a particular way of presenting Joshua, not as a man lying down with the tree sprouting from his belly, but as a Joshua Dendrophorus Joshua. Joshua, it's a rare representation of Joshua. Joshua not carrying the tree, the genealogical tree that gives birth to the Virgin at the top and finally to Christ. So this is quite interesting to see and to look at, because this has a relation also with the hypernaturalism of the Manueline. The Manueline itself, in all this kind of artificial representation in stone of several banal and mainly materials of festivities, like here in one of the other door, in one of the other windows in the facade. You see that we are here facing the representation of the idea that the Manueline late Gothic is a representation of an attempt to create an architecture that is in itself nature. Nature builds, and the architecture is a part of nature, is a naturalized way of presenting architecture. And this is one of the originalities of the Manueline. It's not something that is absolutely unique to the Manueline. There are several examples in the late Gothic, especially in Central Europe, in Bohemia, for instance, of things of this kind. But in the Manueline, you have a lot of this kind of references, as for instance, in the inner side of the church in Tomar, where you find the architectural motives crisscrossed by golden buffs, golden bugs, which are from a tree. And even there is a relationship of the Manueline with pageantry, as I've told you, with the celebration, with joy, and with the attainment of something that was felt as a providential destiny of King Manuel and of the kingdom itself, the kingdom of Portugal. Even in this, we see in stone represented occasion with jingle bells. So we are now near Christmas. So I choose this to finish my presentation. Jingle bells, jingle all the way, because the Manueline architecture, well, has sounds. Na, 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 na.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Paulo, for your wonderful presentation. I
Thank you very
remind
much.
our audience, I remind our audience that we still have some time for questions and answers. Please don't forget to put them on the chat. And I would like now to give the word to our second panelist, Professor Nuno Senos, to deconstruct a little bit what Paulo has just presented as well. Thank you, Nuno, again for your presence.
Okay, thank you, Duarte. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Duarte. Thank you, Luisa. Thank you, Vlad, for putting together this this session. Thank you, Paulo, for having finished on a joyous note, which is welcome, I guess. Of course, Paulo already gave us some information on Manuel himself, on his time. He introduced us to some of the most iconic buildings of the so-called Manueline style. And what I would like to do in as briefly as possible is to reflect a little bit upon the term itself, Manueline architecture, its creation, its potential and its limitations, the light it sheds, as well as the shadows it casts on our understanding of such buildings. It was during a visit to the monastery in Belém, which Paulo presented to us, that a man called Francisco Varnagen came to the conclusion that this building presented certain architectural features that to his mind could not be found elsewhere. And what I'm showing you is the image Varnagen chose to illustrate his book, which was published in 1842. For Varnagen, Belém was the most accomplished example of, and I quote, a Portuguese original style, architectural style, of course. He called it Manueline. The Portuguese intelligentsia of the time immediately adopted this proposal, adhered to it very promptly, and in the following years and decades elaborated it substantially. Through this process of elaboration, Manueline architecture became synonymous with buildings that were profusely decorated with motifs referring to the sea and to the maritime voyages. These buildings became, or Manueline architecture became the architectural materialization of the golden age of the Portuguese discoveries, which coincided, of course, with the reign of King Manuel. King Manuel's personal symbol, the armillary sphere, which Paulo already presented to us, and which he repeated time and again in every building he commissioned, including Belém, which is the example I'm showing you, served this purpose and this reading to perfection, as it could easily be read as a signifier of the king's planetary ambitions. On the other hand, the even more omnipresent rope, I'll show you an example in Tomar, but Paulo has shown us several. The omnipresent rope seemed to lend itself easily to readings that related it to the world of ships and the world of sailing. In time, in fact, the rope itself became so powerful a symbol that by itself it was enough to signify Manueline architecture and the golden age of Manuel's reign. What I'm showing you now is an image of a grand exhibition that took place in Lisbon, organized by the dictatorship in 1940, called Exhibition of the Portuguese World, in which Manueline architecture featured very prominently. I would like to underline three aspects of this understanding of Manueline architecture that I will comment on. First of all, it assumes that there's an architectural language that is national, specifically Portuguese, giving shape to a particular age of glory in Portuguese history, and therefore different from the architecture of the same period in other countries. Secondly, such language is understood as being primarily ornamental, focusing on elements such as the armillary sphere or the robe. Barnard and his followers paid no attention to plan, volumes, or statics. Columns and arches, windows and doors were only interesting to them as physical support of ornament, and all the more so when they disappeared under the ornament. Of course, they loved the window that Paulo showed them, which I'll go back to in a moment. Varnagen and his followers were not interested in the history proper of said language. They identified it with the reign of King Manuel, but did not care about where, when, or how it had been created, or how it had developed. They cared about the context of the selected buildings, but not the history of the style that they had Christians. The first of these ideas was also the first to be questioned. In the 1880s, art and architectural historian Joaquim Vasconcelos wrote violently against Varnagen and his followers, stating that there was nothing particularly original about the Portuguese buildings, that they in fact belonged to the late Gothic language that was common across Europe in this period, and that ultimately they paled in comparison to their much more spectacular and elaborate Spanish cousins. Today, I'm not interested in discussing whether the buildings under consideration should or should not be considered Portuguese, let alone deciding on who wins an imaginary competition with Spain. What I'm most interested in is that these two positions determined, to a great extent, almost everything that's been written about Manueline architecture since. Present company excluded, of course. Almost every author that has written about Manueline architecture in the past 200 years almost has felt compelled to position him or herself in this dispute. Essentially, the literature on Manueline architecture, with some exceptions, can be organized in two groups: that which subscribes to a national approach and that which insists on an international reading. The most extreme cases still identify maritime motifs, or at the opposite end of the spectrum, see little difference between, for example, Batalha from the early 15th century on your left and Boulogne from the early 16th century, or even little difference between these two and, for example, the Cathedral of Salamanca, and they call all this late Gothic. Again, I'm not particularly interested in this discussion. What I would like to underscore is that because of this discussion, the other parts of the argument have been given very little attention. By force of focusing on the ornament of Manueline churches, either to look for or to deny its Portugueseness, aspects relating to plan, volumes, statics, forms of vaulting, light manipulation, all things that a proper architectural analysis should take into consideration, have simply been forgotten, or almost entirely forgotten. Very little attention has been paid to these issues, which, I will briefly argue, are extremely interesting. Furthermore, by force of focusing on Manuel's reign and the extraordinary voyages that did take place under his rule, hardly any consequences have resulted from the fact, well established today, that the invention of a new architectural language that we may call Manueline had nothing to do with King Manuel himself. In order to argue my case, I'll go back in time by one generation to Manuel's parents, Fernando and Beatriz, who were both children and grandchildren of kings, parents of both Queen Leonor and King Manuel, because of the particular way Manuel acceded to the throne, as Paulo explained, and they were both Dukes of Beja. Among the various investments they made in Beja, the city that was headquarters to their dukedom, Manuel's parents had this convent of the Immaculate Conception built. Its construction was authorized in 1459. The acquisition of land and materials and the conception of the plan must have started right away, and it's safe to say that construction proper was underway throughout the 1460s. However, Duke Fernando, Manuel's father, died in 1470. His wife, Beatriz, who survived him by a staggering 36 years, took charge of all family matters, including the construction of this building, and we must consider that she played a major part in the decisions that were made regarding it. The first group of nuns arrived in the convent in 1473, at which point the church and parts of the convent were finished. I would like to call your attention upon only two features that can be found here, only two, but very important ones. First of all, the spiraled shape of the pinnacles, and second, the rope. I trust you can see my pointer. The rope that runs the entire perimeter of the building. They are both, spiraled forms and rope, are both trademarks of the so-called Manueline style, and today it is unanimously accepted that they were used for the first time in Portugal in this building, that is to say, prior to 1473. King Manuel was 4 years old. In other words, had Varnhagen and his followers cared to establish the history of the forms they called Manueline, they'd be in trouble making it the style of King Manuel, who was a very small child when his style was first invented. They would also have found it difficult to relate Manueline architecture to Vasco da Gama's voyage. Vasco da Gama was also 4 in 1473, he was the same age as Manuel, or even to Cabral's voyage, the discoverer of Brazil. Cabral was 6, he was a little older, but still 6 years old. Furthermore, if we look beyond ornament, which has been so central in the discussion of Manueline architecture, we might also notice that this is a single nave church. This is relevant because before the construction of this church, most large, ambitious churches, such as this one, adopted the three-nave plan. Therefore, the Church of the Immaculate is also innovative as far as plan is concerned. It didn't invent a single nave, of course, but it did bring it back into the core of the architectural discussion of its time. And this is all the more important as this is the first of a large series of very significant churches which all follow its lead in adopting the single nave plan. Such was the case, for instance, of the Church of Chagas in Vila Viçosa or the Franciscan Church of Arraiolos. None of them, by the way, none of these two, owes anything to Manuel or his mother. This being said, King Manuel did adopt all the features that I've mentioned so far, ornamental and planimetric, in several of his major commissions, such as the Church of the Holy Cross in Coimbra, which he had entirely rebuilt to accommodate the also newly made tombs of the first and second King of Portugal. Given more time, I could extend my arguments in these and other directions. Time, however, is of the essence, and therefore I will conclude with a few final remarks. To my mind, there is in fact a group of buildings, mostly religious, but not only, that share a number of features. It is useful to have a term under which to group them, as that helps us understand how they are different from those that precede them and those that follow them. Whether we should call them Manueline or not is perhaps not the most important issue. What seems relevant to me is that we do not ignore the origins of such language, whatever we may call it, and do not confuse it with an architectural master plan devised by King Manuel to celebrate the nautical achievements that took place under his rule, even though some of the buildings, as Paulo clearly showed us, do that. Once we put aside this national, and most of all nationalistic view of this group of buildings, then it becomes easier to see the ways in which they were innovative. Ornament is certainly one of the most exuberant and creative aspects, and it should not be underappreciated. But neither should it prevent us from seeing other significant aspects. I've mentioned choices relating to the plan of the churches. Most significant ones were indeed organized in a single nave. But others, perhaps even most spectacular ones, chose the whole church plan. I am showing you the very first one ever built in Portugal, which King Manuel paid for, but that was made for his nanny. The Church of Belém, of course, is the most spectacular example, but whole churches had a long history in Portugal whose origin must also be kept in mind. Let us not allow nationalistic views of Manueline architecture to obscure the extraordinary vaulting solutions that architects came up with, simply because they cannot be related to the world of the sea and of the maritime voyages. This is the main chapel of the Cathedral of Braga, and this is Belém again, perhaps the most extraordinary vault of the period in Portugal and one of the most extraordinary vaults of the period in Europe. Let us not allow the absence of maritime connections to prevent us from seeing and marveling at the extraordinary creativeness of these architects, manipulating volumes, superimposing them, making them intersect in unexpected ways, sometimes cutting stone as if it were clay. 20 years worth of layers of historiography make some of us look at this window and see in it the glories of times past. This is not my vision, as you must have understood by now, neither is it Paulo's as we heard it. But finally, and to end on a hopefully provocative note, and I'm sorry, Paulo, to disagree with you on this, let us not allow for the alternative historiographic vision to make us look at this window and feel satisfied with the term late Gothic. To me, there seems to be very little Gothic in this window. Like all buildings, those we call Manueline, either by this name or any other, will be understood in their own terms or not at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Nuno Senos, for your presentation. And just a brief comment, I thought Italians were the best ones telling stories, but I changed my mind. I think Portuguese are really good at telling stories. We are on time, sharp on time. I just wanted to do make a couple of questions, if you guys could be brief. The first one is from Luisa to Paulo Pereira. She asks, while the first building presented Jerónimos monastery seems to rely on typical Christian imagery, as in much other European Gothic architecture, the second building has a narrative that appears more unique. For example, the tree roots that are cut versus the ones that are intact. Is this a metaphor that appears in other buildings that you are aware of?
Well,
at the end.
It appears in other buildings, but in a much more timid way. And both buildings, Jerónimos and the Convent of Christ, are let's say the buildings that express in a very strong way the ideas that were behind the conception of the rule during King Manuel, and we should think of them, Jerónimos and Convent of Christ, as the result not of the will of Dom Manuel immediately, but of the will of several courtesans and what we would call today Secretary of States, in or ministers here in Europe, or Secretary of State in the United States, which have several responsibilities. For instance, Nuno Senos was someone who studied thoroughly and very thoroughly the importance of some of these let's say technicians or people with the right knowledge to plan and to extract the best of the world at hand. And for instance, in terms of symbolism, I think, and I'm not alone in this, that, for instance, Bartolomeu de Paiva, which was one of these, let's say, Secretary of States of Dom Manuel for religious monuments, had a strong word to say when the commissions were made. Also, Antonio Rodrigues had this particular responsibility within the court. And we shall not forget someone which was a goldsmith and an author of theatrics and very well-known theatrics here in Portugal, which was Gil Vicente. I think, and I'm not, as I've told you, alone in this. For instance, one of our colleagues, masters, one of our masters, Rafael Moreira, suggested that Gil Vicente was someone who had the culture to provide the commissions of these buildings with this kind of ornament and decoration. And if we read the theatrics of Gil Vicente, we see that is someone that knows very well the architects of the time, the master masons of the time, actually, and he knows very well all the things that concern discourse, a narrative, actually, a narrative, which is something that we are discussing here. And let me say that I don't disagree with Nuno Senos. I fully agree with the way that he presents the Manueline, and I think it's one of the steps forward that we have to lean on from now on to better understand. Of course, there are several books on this, and in my I left with you my my PowerPoint. You'll see that in the PowerPoint, after the jingle bells, you have a list with photographs of the covers of several of the books that anyone interested in Manueline should read, because some of them are quite recent, and I'm completely in the same wavelength as of Nuno Senos, in what he said in the interpretation of the Manueline as a long-term, or at least a mid-term endeavor from the late 70s of the 15th century till the kingdom of Dom Manuel, with all this kind of overloaded symbolism that has to do with emblems, heraldry, with something that now finally is called, and when I say this, it is because it's already accepted by the Academy, the Gothic of the Renaissance. O Gótico do Renascimento, the Gothic of the Renaissance, because the Gothic is present during the outburst of the Renaissance, of the Italian Renaissance, as a resistance. Sorry about the.
No. Thank you for your. No, thank you so much. I just have one more question, and this one is for Nuno Senos. It's actually a provoking question, I think, from my colleague and friend Linda Dam. She asks, although theories regarding the Manueline were formed well before the nationalist dictatorship of Salazar, to what extent do you think the ultra-nationalistic and imperialist discourse of the regime contributed to the widespread reading, strongly associating it with the navigation and exploring conquests of the Portuguese? Nuno.
Well, it certainly played an important part. It certainly played a major part. This being said, I think that one of the most important reasons why this kind of reading of Manueline architecture is so pervasive and so difficult to replace, criticize, and demolish is that it's been around for really 600 years.
Yeah.
Because you go back to the chroniclers of the 16th century to find the roots of readings of Jerónimos, for instance, of the monastery of the Way, associating it with an idea of celebration and celebration of maritime voyages. It's in João de Barros, it's in the 16th century chronicles. And it goes on. It becomes even more romanticized in the 17th century chroniclers that describe King Manuel kneeling before the altar in Belém before Vasco da Gama departs to India and promising, or rather commanding the trip to God in that particular place. So it's a very old construction made of many layers. Of course, today it is easier, at least for people up to my generation. I don't think my niece and nephew know what the dictatorship was, but at least until my generation, people, the closest memory we have is very strong coming from the dictatorship. But the last third of the 19th century was incredibly rich in constructing this image, incredibly rich in all sorts of celebrations using, well, celebrating King Manuel, his time, the discoveries, the discoverers, and of course, neo-Manueline architecture, which they brought into the discussion. So yes, the dictatorship played a part, but they're not entirely responsible, or it is not entirely responsible for what we know, for the vox populi on Manuel.
Thank you so much, Nuno. And we had other questions, but we are way above our time. Thank you so much as well, Paul, and for everybody that attended to this
Thank you.
amazing presentations. On behalf of the Center for Portuguese Studies and from FLAD as well, we would like to thank you for your presence here today. And we hope to see you on the next event of the Center for Portuguese Studies, which will be on December 3rd. We're not going to talk about architecture, we're going to talk about the Brexit. So totally different, but you are more than welcome.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. No, I think it was absolutely extraordinary. I would like to thank as well Luisa Caldas, who organized and helped us feel very sad that she had lost her voice, but she was part of this event as well. And I hope to see you soon on our next events, and wishing a very good weekend. And see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nuno.
Thank you so much, and hopefully we
Linda.
can continue this discussion in the future.